Recently, I finished reading this book called Science and Human Behavior by B.F. Skinner. And he's the guy who invented radical behaviorism. And it comes from this long tradition of us trying to identify and study how organisms behave. And radical behaviorism has this three-part model. So there's a discriminative stimulus, there's a response, and there's a reinforcement. So I'm going to go through and kind of just explain how the whole thing works, just from my understanding. All right, so we have an organism, and this organism, it emits its own behaviors. And earlier traditions of studying behavior, they made this choice of identifying that you had a stimulus and response. I think this was Pavlov, respondent conditioning, I believe it was called, where he would present his dogs with a plate of food, and the dogs would start drooling. So in this example of respondent condition, the stimulus is the presence of a plate of food, and the response is involuntary salivation. But B.F. Skinner, he noticed that organisms, they don't tend to just behave in response to something, right? Because organisms, they have like completely new repertoire. There's behavior that they weren't taught before. So in the three-part model of radical behaviorism, it starts off with a discriminative stimulus. So instead of the stimulus directly eliciting a behavior, the discriminative stimulus just allows the organism to know that the likelihood of a reinforcement is, so it lets it know how likely it is that the behavior gets reinforced. So the next part, the second step of the three-part model, is the response itself. It's how the organism chooses to behave, in the sense of the word choose, I guess, because free will isn't really part of radical behaviorism. Like, it's not really studied. But the organism itself, it responds, and then after the response, an appropriate reinforcement is made by either another organism, maybe it's a system, a group of organisms. There's lots of examples that Skinner provides in his book. And when I read this, I did find that the model could adequately explain a very diverse set of examples of behavior that I've seen before. And Skinner, he experimented himself with small animals like pigeons and mice, where he would have these things called Skinner boxes, and he would take a pigeon, for example, and there was this button on the wall. And whenever the pigeon presses the button, he gives it the reinforcement, perhaps of some food. And he observes that the pigeon increases the behavior of pecking at that button. However, when I look at the whole reinforcement model, the operant conditioning is what it's called. Obviously, I began to question, is this a mechanism of nature itself, or is it a pattern of something that's maybe more lower level in the computing sense, like in that analogy? And after thinking about this for a while, I think that Skinner himself, he wasn't anti-neuroscience. I mean, the man died in 1990, and the fMRI was invented in the same year. So I don't think he had very much time to observe the forefront of neuroscience. But even if he did, I think the main question he has is, does this information work as an independent variable, the variable that shifts behavior itself? Because if you're familiar with the part of the brain called the amygdala that controls emotion, you might be tempted to answer a question like, why is the boy angry, with something like his amygdala fired? So, right, maybe his amygdala did show this electric stimulation. And then you question, why did his amygdala fire? And I suppose this is the same problem as even before neuroscience, when you just responded because he was angry. And I think, as Skinner points out, it's always going to bottom out in the environment. So if you were to ask why the boy was angry, maybe the answer isn't that he's just angry, he feels angry. The response with explanatory power always points to something in the environment. So maybe he's frustrated because he repeatedly tried something and didn't get results. Didn't get the results that he wanted. And with this, I think that primitive neuroscience, like just very descriptive neuroscience, it might not satisfy the criteria that Skinner is looking for. However, I think as neuroscience grows more advanced, I think that kind of starts to change. And maybe operant conditioning itself becomes like obsolete and imprecise. So what exactly am I thinking here? Well, imagine if the amygdala itself firing, if that event itself became the event with explanatory power. So what I'm gesturing at here, for example, is, why is the boy angry? Because his amygdala fired. And why did his amygdala fire? Because we stimulate it directly with electrodes. So if we apply specific voltage in a particular pattern and that provokes behavior, then instead of pointing to the environment, maybe we could point to direct electrical stimulation. And I think this has been done before. I've heard of experiments where a researcher took electrodes, connected it to various spots in an animal's brain, stimulated it with voltage, and they showed aggression. So I don't think this is really operant conditioning anymore in the sense that Skinner imagined it. It's more of the whole stimulus response model with respondent conditioning. So while the operant conditioning, I think, is a very useful model if you don't have this deep physiological observation power. If you are in a position where physiology itself can become a manipulated variable, then you can get something like respondent conditioning very directly. And I recall, this was in the book, Skinner himself, he said, respondent conditioning, this model of organisms instinctively behaving in response to a stimulus, that model of instinct or reflex, we found out pretty quickly that it couldn't explain a wide repertoire of behavior. But I think now that if we have this granular control of the brain itself, of physiology, then physiology becomes something with explanatory power, and the input-output stimulus response model, it becomes very valid to explain a much wider range of behavior. Yeah, so that's just basically what I was thinking today. This was unscripted. I think this was probably slightly more informative or useful than my last video. I'm going to keep trying to post consistently. That's all for today. 再见.